everybody, it's Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week, we're going to do something a little bit different on the show, and it may seem like today's topic is a bit far afield for a show that's dedicated to health and wellness, but I think by the end of the show, you'll agree that that's not the case. We're going to talk about industrialized education and the conventional schooling system and how that is just as much of a mismatch with the way that humans are naturally designed to learn as an industrialized diet and lifestyle is with the way that humans are naturally designed to eat and move and live. And to talk about these issues, I'm really excited to welcome Jeremy Stuart. Jeremy is the director and creator of the film Class Dismissed, which looks at unschooling and homeschooling and alternative, well, they're alternative now at least. They were the dominant paradigm for most of human history, but we'll be talking more about that. Alternative models of education. And Jeremy's involvement in the television and film industry has spanned over 25 years. As an editor, he's worked on hundreds of music videos, commercials, and corporate projects, as well as award-winning documentaries and short films for clients such as Lucasfilm, Dolby Laboratories, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Yamaha, Virgin American, Sony, Dave Matthews Band, Acura, and GoPro. Class Dismissed, his directorial debut, has been screened in 7 countries and has received great acclaim in alternative education circles around the world. You can learn more about the film at classdismissedmovie.com. Jeremy is also the proud father of an unschooled 11-year-old daughter, and that's how I met Jeremy. We are in a group locally of parents that are interested in unschooling, parents and kids, and Jeremy's just a fantastic guy, and the film Class Dismissed, I watched. We screened it at one of our meetings, and it was just probably the best introduction to unschooling and the need to critically reevaluate the conventional industrial education system that I've ever come across. So I wanted to invite Jeremy onto the show so that we could talk about learning and education through an ancestral or evolutionary lens, because the way that we learn and how we go about educating our children is every bit as important in terms of our long-term ability to thrive as how we eat and exercise and sleep. And this is, I've always taken a holistic view toward health and well-being, and this is an important topic to discuss, and it's one that doesn't get a lot of airplay, and I haven't heard a lot of intelligent, open discussion about these topics in the mainstream media. So I wanted to take the opportunity to do that here in this show, and I know it's a little different from what many of you expect from this show, but I hope you enjoy it and get a lot out of it. Okay, without further ado, let's jump in and talk to Jeremy Stuart. This episode of Revolution Health Radio is brought to you by 144.me. 144 is a diet and lifestyle reset program I created to help you dial in the 4 pillars of health: nutrition, physical activity, sleep, and stress management. Whether you want to lose weight, boost your energy, treat a chronic health problem, or just maintain your current good health and extend your lifespan, these are the 4 areas you need to focus on before anything else. In the 144 program, I walk you through every step of the process, from cleaning out your pantry and shopping for the right foods, to recipe and meal plans, to video demos of workouts that you can do at home without any special equipment, to guided meditation and stress management programs, to daily sleep tips, to personalized recommendations for what to do after you finish the reset. 144 is a great option whether you're just getting started with this stuff or you've been on the path for a while. In fact, I do a 144 myself 3 or 4 times a year to hit the reset button and give myself a boost. To learn more about how 144 can help you achieve your health goals, head over to 144.me. Okay, now back to the show. Jeremy, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming to join us. So a lot of my work is based on the recognition that there's this fundamental mismatch between our genes and biology. For example, how we naturally eat, how we naturally move, sleep, how we live in close-knit tribal groups, and then our modern industrial environment. And the hypothesis within the ancestral evolutionary diet and lifestyle community is that mismatch is really what's driving the current epidemic of modern disease. But what I'm interested in talking to you about is another possible aspect of mismatch, which is between how humans naturally learn in our kind of wild type environment, if you will, and the public and even private education system that we've ended up with. So do you think that this is it's just a reasonable filter to look at schools as a kind of industrialized education experience that is mismatched with what we're naturally wired for in terms of learning?
Especially with the current condition of industrialized education, with the overemphasis on testing and grading and measuring everybody constantly, I think is a huge disservice to children everywhere in terms of the way we naturally learn. Mm-hmm. And it also is not helping teachers in any way or shape or form either. So, I think there's many things about the whole notion of this kind of forced system of education that is very mismatched with how we should be evolving and learning together.
Mm-hmm. It seems like even from a kind of meta perspective, the public education or the institutionalized education system starts out with this assumption, which is that kids need to be taught to learn.
Yeah, for those people that don't know the history of public education, it started in 1837 with Horace Mann, who was actually nominated to be the first Secretary of Education of this country. And he had returned to the U.S. from a trip to Prussia, in 1848. And he had noticed there that they were implementing a kind of militaristic style of schooling that he felt would be good for this country as we were entering the Industrial Revolution. And so he quickly implemented that throughout the country and really pushed for that to happen. And in Massachusetts, in 1852, they passed a compulsory attendance law. And that was kind of the beginning of what we call our industrial educational system.
Right, because up until then, formal schooling was optional, and it wasn't something that every kid had to do. And what was the reaction to that? First attempt at compulsory schooling?
Not looked upon very favorably at all. In fact, there were instances of because most people learned at home with their families. They were working on the farm or working in the family business and living and learning together in a natural way. And then along comes this legislation that says, no, you have to go to school now. Mm-hmm. And there were instances of children being forcibly removed from their parents and taken to these schools. And of course, there was great opposition to this, but unfortunately, it kind of won out. And by the turn of the century, there everybody was made to go to school, whether they wanted to or not, really.
Right. And there's so many things that are interesting to me about this. One is that we often look at our current lifestyle and assume, because it's so familiar to us, we assume that's kind of always how things were. It's hard for us to imagine anything different. And I think it's probably hard for many listeners out there to imagine a time where, institutionalized education wasn't the norm, where most people were actually learning just in the context of their own life instead of, going to this place called school where they sat in chairs for the whole day and learned things that were really kind of removed from the context of their life. And yet this has really only been the norm for, sounds like, true. About 150 years.
In the sort of context of human history, school is what's new. Homeschooling or other alternative ways of learning have been around much, much longer than that.
Right.
But we're very conditioned, as you said, to believe that the only way you can learn is to be taught in an institution called a school. Right. And of course, that thought process carries no weight at all, especially now in this age of information. Mm-hmm. Perhaps in the Industrial Revolution that might have been true somewhat. Yeah. And even when I was going to school in England, it was hard to get access to information. So, you had to get encyclopedias or, go to the library or go to school and find people that knew about certain things. Now, of course, we can get information at the touch of a button on any device. Mm-hmm. So it sort of brings into question this whole idea of, well, what is the purpose then of having these institutions where you have to go and sit there to get the information for 8 hours a day when you can simply find the information in a couple of seconds.
Absolutely. The other piece of that that's interesting to me, just from a sociological perspective and historical perspective, is writers like John Holt and others who have argued that industrialized education was really a way of conditioning kids to fit into the new system of industrialized labor, as a kind of conditioning them to be cogs in the machine, really, rather than the sort of the more craft-based artisanal economy, local economy that
it's very true. I mean, he's
before
written
that.
about it, and also John Taylor Gatto has written about it a lot, who was a New York public school teacher for 30 years and then went on to write an amazing op-ed piece in the New York Times about why he was quitting, because he no longer wanted to damage children. And, going back to Horace Mann, who started all of this in 1852, he believed that school was a great equalizer, and that values such as obedience to authority and promptness in attendance and organizing time according to bell ringing would actually help students prepare for future employment in the industrial age. So the whole purpose of it was set up to train factory workers,
right,
and to respond to bells, to respond to cues, to be told when to do something and how to do it and for how long, so that they would become efficient worker bees in this industrial revolution. And of course, in Congress at the time, all the people that were supporting Mann's vision were all the industrialists, the Carnegie Mellons and
Absolutely. The people who would benefit from that kind of labor force.
Supporting this and pushing it through this. So that's why this whole system kind of came into being in the first place.
Yeah, I wanted to at least touch on that because I think the history of institutionalized schooling in this country is not very well known. It's certainly something I wasn't taught in school.
There are many teachers that don't even know the sort of history of why industrial schooling was set up.
Right. And John Taylor Gatto, who was a teacher for 30 years, as you mentioned, I think one of the first kind of public forums where he voiced his, criticism of the public schooling system was at the speech, his own speech that he gave when he was presented with an award for being the Teacher of the Year. Isn't that right?
He was nominated Teacher of the Year, I think twice, or maybe even 3 times by the state of New York. And
right.
I think it was on the third one that he said, "I can't do this anymore." Yeah.
Right. Right. So he was the best of the best, and yet he still saw that the system was failing. Yeah. So if we extend this metaphor of industrialized education, we know that when people follow an industrialized diet, they develop all kinds of illnesses and chronic diseases. So what are some of the symptoms, perhaps, of industrialized education? You've made a film where you interviewed lots of people who were doing traditional, or we could say maybe modern education in a kind of conventional setting. And then you've talked to lots of parents who've unschooled or homeschooled their kids, and you've done that yourself. So what would you describe as the symptoms of industrialized education, and maybe what are some of the risks and complications for kids and parents in that system?
Well, I think the biggest one these days would be stress, both for parents and teachers, and certainly for the kids. Because there's been so much emphasis placed on the testing and grading and measurement and teaching to the test, it's put huge pressure on families to comply, teachers to comply, and kids, of course, face the brunt of all of this. There's been several other films made about this. The Race to Nowhere is one. There's another more recent one. I'm trying to think of the name of it. Can't think of it right now. But anyway, there's been a number of films that have spoken specifically to this issue of the suicide rate in high schools is increasing because the kids are feeling so much pressure and stress to do well to these tests that is just having really horrible effects on their well-being. And then, of course, the whole homework issue, the fact that so many kids have hours of homework after they've completed a whole day in school, and they're up till 2 a.m. doing homework, so therefore they're not getting enough sleep, so therefore they're not focused when they're at school, and therefore they're not eating well.
Right.
And then parents having to nag the kids to do the homework, and that creates stress within the family. So the family unit is suffering. The list is sort of endless, really. I think that we're in a real crisis situation with this particular methodology.
And it's interesting to me that what seems to be the response, as far as I can tell, is people recognize that it's not working, but the response, instead of stepping back and critically evaluating the entire model, is to just do more of the same harder. So, for example, and even though we have lots of research that's showing that homework is not effective, it doesn't improve kids' learning ability, especially like at a very early age. It seems like just more testing, more homework, more college prep at an earlier age, like to the point where kindergartners, I heard a parent just yesterday was telling me that the teacher told her that her kindergartner had fallen behind. And my response was, behind what? What's going on here? So, I mean, that's one thing that stands out to me. It's just that that's the definition of insanity, right? Is doing more of the same thing and expecting a different result.
Yeah, it's totally dysfunctional, and you're absolutely right. It seems to be just more testing. Then the school day needs to be longer. Then these measurements aren't stacking up to our expectations. So let's add on more layers of work and stress and homework to make those scores go up, as if somehow those scores are the measurement of what learning is.
Right.
And in fact, it's completely the opposite. And there's been so much research done on and available out there about other countries who have implemented things that are really effective. Like Finland, for instance, is the big one that everybody looks at these days. In Finland, you don't start school until you're 7. Mm-hmm. And they also do not organize subjects into neat little packages or separate them out from each other. They're very integrated. Right. There's also no homework at all, period, until you're a teenager. Mm-hmm. And then it's very minimal. And there's also absolutely no testing until you're a teenager. And then there's only one test, one standardized test that all kids of teenage years take. They also get 75 minutes a day of recess, as opposed to 27 minutes in the US. Their school days are far shorter. Yeah. There's no measurement or grading for 6 years, and they spend 30% less on students than in the US, and they outrank 65 other countries in performance results. Yeah, so, it blows my mind to read those statistics and then hear things like, well, we need longer days, or we need more testing, or we need, more grading, or it's just like completely the opposite direction of where we should be going. Yes. And, my listeners will be very familiar with the notion that our concurrent conventional medical paradigm is really out of touch with the research. Like if you go to the doctor, you might be prescribed a treatment that is not really closely aligned with what the most current research says about what should be done in that situation. But I'll tell you what, the gap between, conventional medicine and the research literature is 1/10 of what the gap is between how education is practiced and what the research literature says about learning. Right. It's not even in the same ballpark. I mean, it's admittedly not my area of expertise, but I have read quite a lot of research about education. And as an undergraduate, my major, one of my majors was education. So I know a little bit about it. And, correct me if I'm wrong, there are really no studies that support what we're talking about is happening here. The idea that more testing, more homework at an earlier age is going to do anything but harm kids. I have not seen any studies that support those ideas. Right, that's very true. I mean, all the studies say the opposite, and then there's some other really interesting work being done, research being done by people in this country. So, we were talking about Finland, but in this country and elsewhere in the world, actually, Sir Ken Robinson gave an incredible TED talk about how schools kill creativity. It's one of the most viewed talks, TED talks in history. And he's specifically talking about, again, I think the idea of there's so much emphasis on testing and measurement and grading that kids have forgotten how to be creative. Yes. And they're losing their passion. They don't even know what their passions are. I'm sure if you went to a high school or even a middle school age and you pulled some kids out and said, what are your passions? What really drives you? What are you really interested in? many of them would have no idea at all.
Well, from my perspective, this is one of the most harmful things about institutionalized education, and Alfie Kohn talks about it a lot. The difference between extrinsic motivation, when you're forced to do things that you may or you don't necessarily want to do, and intrinsic motivation, which is motivation that comes from within, from you being in touch with your own desires and passions. And the way our school system is set up is to reward extrinsically motivated activities. It's from, like you said, every time the bell rings, you get up. It doesn't matter how immersed you are in what you're doing. The lesson is that when the bell rings, it's time to put that down and go to the next thing. And you're told what to be interested in, by what subjects are taught in school, and they're separated into nice little chunks and not connected at all. And there's really no place for someone's passion or interest to unfold in a institutionalized schooling environment.
No, none at all. And that also goes for the teachers, who are in the really unfortunate position of not being able to teach, because mostly what they're doing is classroom management, making sure people are where they're supposed to be and sitting in their seats at the right times, and being quiet and attentive. And then the other part of their job is basically teaching to the test, to make sure that the material that's going to be on the test will be covered, so that the kids can get good results and the school can get funding. Right. And, that's not teaching.
Right.
That's just management. So the whole system is really in a very sad state, I think, at the moment. And, we're definitely moving in the wrong direction in terms of making any positive changes that will actually make any difference.
Yeah. That's what's alarming to me. And that's one of the reasons I really wanted to have this discussion with you, because I think a lot of people are aware that there's a problem, but they may not know exactly why. It's kind of that something's happening. You have some kind of pain or ache, but you don't know why. And just hopefully this conversation will help shed some light on that question for people. And then, of course, the next question a lot of people are going to have is something along the lines of, okay, well, let's say I agree with you guys, and there are these problems with the institutionalized schooling. What's the alternative? Because the way that homeschooling is portrayed in this country is, I think, intentionally as a sort of backwards thing that only people do who don't care about their kids or whether their kids are going to go to college or be successful or have a social life or anything like that. So, on the other hand, there seems to me is a growing and thriving community of people who have sought out alternatives and have made different choices, like yourself. And so, and you, I think, have a unique perspective on this because you made this film. You talked to so many people who are either already doing it, have done it, or are considering doing it. And then you track that family who went from not doing it to, fully doing it, and everything that happened in between. So tell us, just kind of first starting with like the 30,000 foot view, what are some of the alternatives to industrialized education, and maybe some of the differences between those alternatives?
Sure. Yeah, that's a big subject.
Yeah, just start with the meta view, and then we'll dive down.
Obviously, homeschooling has been around for a very long time, and as you said, the perceptions of homeschooling, I think, are very misguided in this country. It's often portrayed in the popular media in a negative way, but actually, statistically, it's the fastest growing form of education in the country today. It's growing by about 15% a year. And of course, there's many, many, many ways to approach homeschooling. Homeschooling is just one word for it, and I don't particularly like that terminology because when you hear the term homeschooling, you think, okay, well, the kids are just going to be home all day, and they're going to be doing school.
Right. They're sitting at the kitchen table with all the same books and things that they had at school.
Right, recreating school at the kitchen table. And I've interviewed many people on the street about this, and I've asked them specifically what images come to mind when I mention this word, and that's the image that comes to mind. Yeah. Now, for some families that works, and that's fine. If that works, then great. Mm-hmm. But for the majority of families that I've met and talked to, that only works for a short period of time, and then they soon realize that this is not the most effective way for them to have a relationship with each other and to learn anything. And they tend to get a bit more eclectic, and perhaps do away with structured curriculum that looks too or trying to create school too much. and lean more towards another form of homeschooling called unschooling, which is basically another term for that would be life learning, kind of learning from experiences in life. Instead of following a curriculum, just try to follow the student or their children's interests. Find out what are they passionate about, what interests them, and then support them in that. Help them find resources, point them in the right direction, give them the tools necessary for them to really explore what they're interested in. And then, of course, their motivation is intrinsically driven,
right?
And the learning is much more effective. And time and time again, I've talked to people that have said this. That when they sat down, for instance, and said, "Okay, we're going to homeschool. I'm going to sit here and teach you these math subjects, through these worksheets." The kids were like, "No, we're not going to do that."
Yeah, no, you're not.
Ended in tears. I mean, from my own personal experience, we tried that with our daughter. We said, "Okay, we need to do some math. Let's get some worksheets." And we thought it was a fun book and that there was, fun little activities. And it always ended in tears and arguments, and it just never got anywhere.
Yeah.
And so we quickly abandoned that idea and realized that there's plenty of other ways that you can learn some basic math without having to sit and do worksheets.
Right.
So the unschooling approach is very much more looking at life in general and being involved in life at every level and finding learning opportunities within your everyday activities. And the other thing that I've come across lately in traveling with my film and meeting lots of people is that there are more and more little kind of collectives of people coming together in communities to create mini learning centers. I don't want to use the word school there because I dislike the word school completely, but
some people call them free schools or
study schools, free schools, learning centers. It can happen with 3 or 4 or 5 parents who are homeschooling, kind of getting together and pooling their resources and saying, let's help each other out. Let's kind of create some vision around this that we can support each other. And I think this is where community plays a really big role in all of this. I think the other thing about industrialized education is it's damaging communities.
Right.
There's this sort of attitude that if you send your kids to school, you can kind of just wash your hands of all the responsibility for their education and assume that the school is giving everything that your child needs. And that's a very big assumption, and clearly it's one that's not working. And therefore, I think that sort of also breaks down the level of involvement with the community and your family and people around you. Whereas homeschooling and unschooling kind of forces you to seek that out.
Yeah.
You need that to support each other. And so I've been very excited to see in the last year, especially, all kinds of little learning centers popping up all over the country. And, some of them are very small, maybe, 4 or 5 families. Some of them are really quite big and are doing amazing things. And they're so different than the way a school would operate. I actually feature one of them in my film. They've been around for 10 years, but, on the surface, it looks like a school, but actually it's not, because the kids are choosing to be there. And also the kids are choosing what to learn and how long they want to spend learning it. So the whole thing is driven by the interests of the children rather than some quote unquote educators saying, this is what you're going to learn now.
And I really just want to keep coming back to that because I think that's the crucial difference. And, using your example, with math, where the curriculum, the way the school curriculum is set up, all the subjects are extracted and the learning is completely out of context from the child's interests or life in it, and whereas if, let's say your kid gets interested in animals and decides to go work, spend a couple days in the office of a veterinarian, and as part of that, they have to learn how to ring people up with a cash register. And so then they start learning math that way, and that's going to happen so much more quickly and naturally. And they see the relevance of it immediately. And it's directly related to something that they care about and are interested in. And I mean, just for all the listeners, if you think of any time that you've ever been engrossed in something or, really passionate about something, how much of a sponge you are for information on that subject and how it's something, I mean, for me, it's the thing that I love to do most is to learn, but it took me years to recover that passion after, exiting the formal education system. And it took me years to get back to determine what it is that I was most passionate about and interested in. That's why I didn't start doing this work until I was in my 30s. That I'm doing now, because it took me that long to actually to recover from
recovery period.
Yeah, it was a long and painful period, and lots of therapy and difficult periods to get back to it. So that's one thing that I think is a really crucial difference. I think there's some other things that make unschooling stand out or homeschooling from conventional education, and one is there isn't age segregation. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's an important one. I mean, in school, and this sort of ties into a little bit with the whole socialization question, which is one of the big ones that comes up when you speak to people about homeschooling. They say, well, what about socialization? But let's get back to the first part of your question there. So when you go to school, generally speaking, you're in a classroom with 20 or even as many as 30 now people of more or less the same age within 1 year on either side, which is a very unnatural kind of thing. It's kind of not like that in the real world. I mean, you're never going to be in a place in life where you're only surrounded by people your same age. So that's a very unnatural aspect of forcing people of the same age, putting them all together, like categorizing them by date of manufacture and saying, only you guys are going to learn this particular subject now, because there's lots of research to show that actually mixed age learning is really, really powerful. And there's some incredible research been done by Sugata Mitra out of the University of Newcastle, I believe it is. And he did this incredible experiment in India called the hole in the wall experiment. It's been well documented online, where he took a computer and he put it in a hole in a wall in a slum in Delhi, and just left it there, turned it on, hooked it up to the internet, and walked away. And the kids gathered around it, and none of them spoke any English, and they were all ages, little ones, teenagers, and they'd never seen a computer, and none of them spoke English. And he came back 3 months later and said, well, how's it going? And they said, well, we need a faster processor. We need to play games better. And the older ones were teaching the little ones, and the little ones were teaching the older ones, and they had taught themselves English. And they were, Googling things, they were playing online games, they were learning about things, all without any adult supervision whatsoever.
Yeah, and probably if there had been, it would have gone a lot worse.
Yeah, and so he repeated this experiment in multiple places and got exactly the same results. Mm-hmm. And so he's since gone on to establish what he calls schools in the cloud. And he's building several of them in India. He got a big grant to do so, where it's basically a glass-walled building, so you can see in and see out. It's not walled off in any way. And the kids can come and go as they please. And there's high-powered computers connected to the internet, and they can get online and learn whatever they want. Mm-hmm. And it's kids of all ages. So the little ones often help the big ones out. The big ones help the little ones. And when they really get stuck, they can go online and Skype with retired teachers that Sugata Mitra calls grannies in the cloud, and ask questions and get some help directly from these retired teachers who are basically sitting around, with all this information that they're not being utilized. And so he calls this system SOLE, S-O-L-E, or self-organized learning environments. Mm-hmm. And to me, that it's just so fascinating to read his research and to listen to him speak about it, because basically these kids are teaching themselves and helping each other out. And he calls it minimally invasive education.
That's fantastic. Another perfect metaphor that extends to medicine and health, because most people will be familiar with the idea that in any kind of medical procedure, you want to choose the least invasive path that you possibly can to get the greatest impact. And I think probably some people who are listening this question might be percolating at this point, which is, okay, this all sounds great, but colleges and universities, there are lots of statistics that say that if you have a university education, you have more upward mobility, and a lot of colleges have certain criteria that they look for in terms of what, entrance. So I may be kind of, philosophically on board with this, but I want my kid to go to college, so I can't possibly unschool them or homeschool them.
Right, right. And that's definitely another big sort of barrier in some people's minds to this notion. But here's the interesting thing is colleges now, including all the major ones, Stanford and Yale and Harvard, are actively seeking kids who are homeschooled or unschooled or who had an alternative type of education. Because what's different about those kids is that they're still interested in learning.
Mm-hmm.
And, they haven't had that, as you said earlier in your experience, they haven't had that sort of desire and passion to learn beaten out of them, and then they have to recover and try to regain it. They're interested in learning because they're intrinsically motivated. And colleges are finally starting to realize this and are actively seeking out homeschooled and unschooled students. In fact, I read a statistic that and I may have the numbers slightly off here, but I think Stanford's admission rate for homeschooled kids is 26% as opposed to 6% for traditionally schooled kids. Yeah,
dramatic.
so it's a big deal because I think what they're finding is that by the time kids get to college age, they're done. Mm-hmm. They're exhausted. Mm-hmm. They've been beaten down. They're super stressed out. They're probably, many of them, only going to college because their parents tell them they have to go in order to, get this particular career or job, or, society kind of expects it. And there's a lot of people out there doing research around this too, about whether having a college degree really is all it's made up to be. And I think that the general consensus is that's beginning to change. For instance, at Google, and some of the big tech companies, they don't even look at your resume. Mm-hmm. They don't care where you went to college.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, but I heard someone mentioned that they knew someone who got an interview there, and he handed over his resume, and the guy just put it in the trash and said, "Let's talk about this problem that I have." Mm-hmm. And he presented some sort of problem, and the guy had to give him answers on how he would solve that.
Yeah.
Well, and they're more interested in that kind of thinking than, I don't care what degree you have or MBA you have. It doesn't make any difference at this point because it's just a piece of paper and there are hundreds of thousands of applicants with MBAs.
Yeah.
How do we sort them out and know which one is the best?
Absolutely. I mean, on a much smaller scale than Google, I have a lot of employees and I don't look at resumes. I maybe barely glance at them. And we have an audition process that we put that people go through when they apply. And then in the interviews, I'm mostly interested in seeing how someone's mind works and whether they're able to learn effectively and take initiative and solve problems independently. And those, it's actually quite shocking to me. And this is kind of a thing that we talk about often within the company, how many people don't get through the audition, even with, stellar credentials. So I think it's something that's probably going to be changing even more. It's already changing, and it's something that's going to be changing. And then, of course, the other question is, what kind of future do you want for your children? Do you want them to go to work for a big company that values that kind of resume experience? That's certainly, it's a valid option. It's it's one path, but there are many other paths that might be more rewarding for someone to take if they had that choice. If they were in touch with a way that they could pursue their own interests and support themselves financially. I wonder how many people would choose to work for a big company. Is that really someone's passion, or is that something that comes from maybe just not being sure what else to do? And I hope that isn't, I don't mean any judgment by that, because I've worked for companies myself, and I know many people that work for companies and have really rewarding careers, and they're happy doing it. But, I can't help thinking about the history of industrialized education and, tying that to this particular concern.
It's a very good question. And I think about that a lot, myself. Just from my own personal experience, I graduated high school and I was done. I had no intention of going to college, and everything I've done in my adult life, I've done because I chose to do it and because I was interested in learning about it. And I wonder too, that same question, if you took away that sort of societal pressure of you have to go to college to be successful, if you take that out of the equation, how the world would be different. Because, there's, again, it comes down to what is success? How do you define that? Is success having a six-figure salary and, in a big corporation and working your way up the ladder? Or is success just being happy and joyful in your life and loving what you do?
Yeah.
How do you define that? But I think we have very, very narrow and limited visions of what and definitions of what that is in our society. And so everybody is sort of funneled into this same, track as if that's the sort of golden ticket.
Yeah.
Perhaps in a different time it was. In my father's era,
right.
Late 40s and 50s, then perhaps, that did make sense. But we're not living in that age. We're living in an entirely different age. The thing is we don't really know what the world is going to look like in 2 years.
No.
5 years. So how can we be preparing kids for careers that we don't even know if they exist yet?
Exactly.
There's all kinds of things that are being constantly created in terms of work and ways to make an income that we don't even know about.
So why not prepare them to learn and be as flexible and adaptable and as capable of learning new things as they come along as possible? And is traditional schooling really the way to do that?
Right.
So I want to address one more fear that people often have about unschooling before we move on, which is that my child will fall behind. And, I just want to use a story about this. A friend of ours also unschooled their daughter, and she didn't learn to read until she was 10 years old. And, by the standards of conventional education, that's alarmingly late, right? That's like freak out, oh my God, this is unacceptable. What's going to happen? But I'll tell you what, she learned to read at 10, and by age 12, she was reading the same books I was reading because we lived in the same place. And she was asking me for book recommendations, and I would just tell her what I was reading at the time. And I'm pretty, I'm a voracious reader. I tend to read, 2 or 3 books a week, and they're not typically light books. They're history, a lot of nonfiction. Even the fiction I read tends to be pretty thick. And she was just right there at 12 years old. So within 2 years, she had not only caught up, but leapfrogged everyone in her cohort. And now she's in her 20s, early 20s, and she still reads voraciously and way more than any other kid her age that I know, because it came from intrinsic motivation, her own desire to learn to read when she was ready to read instead of being forced to read.
Right. Yeah, that's a very important point. And again, I've met many people like that too, particularly unschooled kids who didn't read till 10 or even 12. And then suddenly they start reading because they have such desire to do so on their own that they'll do anything to make it happen. I heard a great story once. I was at a conference and I attended a teen panel of unschoolers. And these were all kids who had never been to traditional school. And many of them have never actually set foot in a school. And there was one young man there, and he had enrolled to a university to study astrophysics. And someone said to him, well, obviously you're interested in astrophysics, so that wasn't the question. The question was, why would you enroll yourself in a college when you've never set foot in a school, and what's that like, and how did you manage to get in? And he said, well, I realized that the only way to really study it to the degree that I wanted was at this particular institution. And so I applied. And when I applied, I realized I didn't really know any math. And he said, I went to my parents and I was kind of upset. Well, how come you never taught me any math? And they said, well, you weren't interested. And he said, well, I need it now. And they said, well, you know what to do. So he went to the library and he got grade 1 math, and then grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and so on. And he spent 3 months just reading math books. And in 3 months, he took the necessary examination to enter the college and got 92% on the test.
Right.
So he learned, 12 years of math in 3 months.
Yes.
Because all he did was he knew that this was what he needed to do in order to get to his next goal in life, which was to study at this particular institution. And so he just sat down and put his mind to it and blotted out everything else and just said, I'm going to do this. And he did it.
Right.
And I was blown away by that story. I'm like, what? That's amazing. Yeah. When you're really motivated and driven and you want to achieve something, then amazing things can happen.
Right. And I mean, this reminds me a little bit of Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician who didn't really have any formal training in mathematics. They just made a movie about him. I can't remember what the movie is called, but he just, sent some of his kind of scribbles, mathematical formulas in a journal to G.H. Hardy, who was like one of the most famous mathematicians in the world at that time, a British mathematician. And apparently, I was listening to an interview on NPR. Like, we're still figuring out some of this guy's formulas, and he lived in the early 1900s, and we still, like, he predicted certain things related to math. That black holes hadn't even been discovered, but some of his equations predicted how things would behave in black holes.
Wow,
that's how brilliant this guy was, and he had no formal training in mathematics at all. And then, of course, I think of there are other examples of people who've achieved just incredible things. Christopher Paolini, for example, the author of Aragon, Eldest, and Brissinger, which is a very popular fantasy novel series, started writing those at the age of 15, I think. And he was homeschooled. And so it's just important to remember, if you take this path, or if you're worried about falling behind, that part of a more organic approach to learning involves recognizing that it doesn't happen at the same pace or look the same way for every different kid. And that's one of the downsides of the conventional education system, is that it doesn't recognize that. And, I'm constantly going on and on about the fact that there's no one size fits all approach when it comes to diet and health. So why would we assume that there would be a one size fits all approach to something like education?
Right. And then, it comes back to that question of falling behind according to whom?
Right. To what standard?
Who are these mysterious people that are saying that you have to be able to read by the age of 5 or 6?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where's that coming from?
Yeah. Completely arbitrary standards that somebody created at some point. So I want to, as we're starting to wrap up, I want to maybe make this a little more tangible for people. And since you've unschooled your daughter, maybe you could just talk a little bit about that, you're personally, like maybe starting with what some of her days or years or weeks would look like, just so people have a clue, like, what does this mean? Is she really just at home all day? Or, what was she doing? And, then maybe a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced and how you approach those.
Sure, yeah. So my daughter's 11, mm-hmm. and she's never been to school at all. And she's home some of the time, mm-hmm. and she's out a lot of the time. And she has a lot of passions and interests that we, my wife and I, do our best to support and encourage. And one of those is music. Mm-hmm. So she likes to play piano and write songs. She's a songwriter, and she writes all her own lyrics and writes all her own tunes. And when she was 7, she said, "I want to make an album." So, we found a friend of mine who has a recording studio, and she went in and recorded 5 songs and made a CD. And this is where the math came in, because then we had to figure out how much we were going to sell the CD for. Yeah. And so she went through that whole process and sold a bunch of CDs to her friends and at homeschool conferences and things. And then since then has been working on her second album. Mm-hmm. And she likes to perform live at various open mic nights in the area where we live. So that's just one of her interests. She does Aikido. She does math. She's learning to speak French online. She takes an online course with a native French speaker. And a group of other people that call in from all over the world to practice French together. Mm-hmm. Our days sometimes are structured and sometimes are not, because there are classes that she takes because she wants to take them. So we sign her up for things that she's really interested in. She did some science camps with a place called Quantum to learn some biology and chemistry, and she enjoyed those very much. She also spends one afternoon a week at a working farm. Mm-hmm. Where she is interacting with animals and learning about nature and going on hikes and making things and milking goats and all kinds of stuff like that, which she really, really loves. And it's always changing. And this is the wonderful thing I like about this particular approach, is that you have to be flexible and you have to be willing to shift and flow as things change, because all of us are constantly seeking out new interests and finding things that sort of pique our interest. And as a parent of an unschooled child, it's really important to pay attention to what your kid is doing. Like, what is she into right now? And also to introduce new things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she doesn't really know much about this, so let's maybe talk about that, or let's go online and find something that might be interesting to her about it. And sometimes we find that it isn't, and she doesn't want to know. We're like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
And we just step away. Another time she says, yeah, that's kind of cool. And, let's find out more about it. Let's go and travel somewhere. Like recently, she's been getting into Greek mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And we just we just got back from a vacation in Europe. And when we got back, we were talking about how hard it was to come back because we were enjoying ourselves so much over there. And she said, I want to go back to Europe. And I said, well, where would you go? She said, well, Greece, because I want to go to Athens.
Mm-hmm.
And so clearly this is a passion of hers. So as parents, for us, it's very interesting to kind of watch that ebb and flow. There are frustrations sometimes. I mean, there are days when it seems like she's doing nothing or reading all day. And it's hard to not sort of jump in and say, you should be doing something else. You've just been reading for the last 6 hours. Like, do something else. Let's do some math, or let's do something else. And I have to always catch myself when I do that, because I think most of what's happening there is my own conditioning.
Yeah.
The way I was conditioned at school to think that if you're not doing something quote unquote productive, then you're wasting time. But I think there's huge value in recognizing that and then stepping back from it and just allowing things to unfold. But it's challenging as a parent, definitely.
Sure. I mean, we have our own conditioning to unwind there. And we went through a school where there was first period is English, second period is math, third period is science. So, we have this idea that every day there should be an equal amount of learning on all these different subjects, which is not really how nature works, right? There are seasons, there are natural rhythms of coming and going, but I could imagine that would be really difficult if you were, as products of the conventional education system ourselves. Even if we believe that in our hearts, there's a lot to unwind there.
There is, and there's a name for that. That's the deschooling process.
Right.
And I think as a parent of a homeschooled child or unschooled child, you have to really focus on deschooling yourself, meaning unraveling all of the conditioning that school implemented in you and forced into you about how learning should look like, what it should look like, what it should be, and when and how. All of that you can throw out and get rid of, but it's hard to get rid of. Sometimes it's easier than other days. There are days when it's fine to just it seems to flow really well, and other days where I sort of get anxious and think, she should be doing something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have to question, well, where's that coming from?
Right.
Is that me? Is that my conditioning? Or is it, what should she be doing? She's enjoying herself doing what she's doing. So who am I to step in and say it should be something else?
Right.
And invariably when I do step in and say it should be something else and we try it, it doesn't work.
Right. Which is a hint.
Which is a really big hint.
Yeah.
Oh, Dad, back off. I was quite happy doing what I was.
And I imagine this is where community can be helpful. If you have a group of other people who are facing the same kind of challenges, just the ability to talk to them and share the experience and get just a reflection of, oh yeah, I went through that same thing and this is what happened, this is what I found.
It's very, yeah.
So, along those same lines, since you've been through this and you're still going through it, I imagine there are some choices that you made early on that you might not make now, knowing what you know now. Does anything come to mind in that category?
You mean in terms of if we would have done anything differently?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good question. For the most part, it really works for us. Other than there's days when I think both my wife and I kind of worry sometimes, when that voice of conditioning kind of really raises its head, we start to worry sometimes. Are we doing the right thing? Should we do something different? How can we change something? But the thing I like about that is that it's incredibly active and alive to be engaged in that conversation, as opposed to being passive. We could just as easily send our daughter to school and sort of assume that they're going to take care of everything and we wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. But the very act of having to look at it and think about it and constantly kind of reevaluate it, I find really engaging and active. And I think that's a really good part of this. We had to make some lifestyle choices. I mean, I tell people all the time that homeschooling and unschooling is not just an educational choice, it's a lifestyle choice. We had to make changes in our personal lifestyle and work situations in order to make this happen. But those were choices that we were willingly able to make. We thought about them and said, yes, we're going to do this because this really makes sense for us. I think a lot of people are afraid of doing that. Well, we both have to work full time. How's this ever going to work? And I think that's a whole nother subject. You have to sort of look at, well, what are your priorities? Is it making good money and having the house and the boat on the weekends? Or, can one of you work part-time in order to be home to make this happen and facilitate this lifestyle? So there's definitely things that we had to do. And it's tricky sometimes juggling it all. It's definitely challenging. We don't have the luxury of regular paychecks sometimes, and we're both independently employed, and so there's a lot to juggle there. But again, it all just sort of it's all part of the whole experience of living together and learning together. Right. And I think that our daughter learns a lot from witnessing us in those situations. When I'm working at home, for instance, she sees what I'm doing, and we talk about what I'm doing, and she sees what that process is. And then when I'm at home and I'm not working, we have time to do things together. And so all of it sort of blends together, really. Living and working and learning is all the same thing.
Right. And that's organic education for you. If we were to think about what an analog, again, would be for people who are interested in an ancestral approach to nutrition and lifestyle, if we extend that out further, what would an ancestral approach to education be? This is it. This is where there's no hard line between life and work and learning, because those are all part of just our experience as human beings.
Right.
So, Jeremy, I want to finish up by talking a little bit more about your film, which I think is the best introduction to homeschooling and unschooling that I've ever seen. I mean, if you're welcome. It was an incredible film. We're going to be unschooling Sylvie, our daughter. And for the people in our life that we want to understand unschooling better as a choice, like our parents, for example, your film was, I think, really helpful in just giving people a quick but thorough introduction into this world, and in a open-minded and balanced way. And I love how you used a family and their arc through the whole process as the through line for the film, because it just made it so much more relatable and real. And especially the family goes through almost this entire spectrum that we've talked about. They start off in a conventional school. They then do the around the kitchen table version of homeschooling, with the curriculum, and then the kids lose interest in that. And then even at some point, the kids decide to go back to school, right, on their own choice. And the parents let them do that. And that doesn't last very long, because they're like, oh, no way, forget that. And then they end up doing a more kind of unschooling approach. And so it's really interesting to watch that whole progression. My question for you about the film is, what did you learn in the process of making that film, if anything, that surprised you or that you didn't expect, or that, where you came out of that experience differently than when you went into it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the things that surprised me in the course of making the film, it took 4 years. And, I met countless families all over the country and in various different states. And what really was interesting to me is just how much variation there is in approaches to learning outside of a traditional classroom. I mean, I met people that were doing more school of at home approach and unschooling and radical unschooling and everything in between. And yet somehow or other, it all worked for each of those families. And I was really touched by that and kind of moved by it, because, I realized that that's the sort of essence of it. I mean, and I tell new people who are interested in homeschooling and talk to me about it all the time that, you can call it whatever you want to call it. The terminology is not important, but what's important is to find what really works for you and your particular family. Whether it's more structured or whether it's looser or more eclectic, it doesn't matter. And you can label that in any way that you want. And of course, it may change, and often does. Actually, I should say it will change and evolve as your children grow and evolve, and as you grow and evolve. And I just saw this over and over and over again with the various people that I interacted with in the making of the film. And at the end of the day, it all just somehow comes together, and it sort of blows me away that that's possible. And I think that when you really trust that your children know how to learn, and you instill that love of learning in them and encourage and support that, then amazing things happen. And I saw that over and over again, and that was really a powerful experience for me and very affirming, in my own experience.
Absolutely.
With unschooling our daughter, because of course, there's doubts. I have doubts just like everyone else does, and every good parent, and just to hear from all of these different families that were trying things in all kinds of different ways, and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding, but somehow or other it's all kind of working, and it's all just part of this amazing thing called life, and that was just amazing to be a part of and to witness. So I think that's probably the thing I came away with the most.
That's inspiring, and I think will help people to get their heads around this to some degree, because everyone's life looks different, and some people have jobs where they can work at home. Other people don't have that. And it's important to understand that this isn't, the whole point of this is that it's not supposed to just look one way. It's about education as part of life, and everyone's life is different. So it makes sense that unschooling or homeschooling will look different for different families based on how their life looks. And that's totally okay. And it's even encouraged. So that's one of the main differences. Well, this has been really great, Jeremy. And I know that people are going to get a lot out of this. I also know that people are going to want to learn more, and they're going to have, questions. Knowing my audience, they're going to want to learn, they're going to want to do their own research and find out more. So first of all, tell us where people can learn more about your film. And then all the resources you mentioned in our interview today, we'll make sure to put links to them in the show notes on the website. But then if you have any other resources that you would recommend, or conferences or anything like that, let me know if any come to mind right now, and we'll add those too.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So to find out more about the film, people can visit my website, which is classdismissedmovie.com. Classdismissedmovie.com. So, there's the trailer for the film on there, and then all the information about the film and screenings and various things. You can also purchase the film on DVD or rent it as a downloadable or rentable, streamable version. So that's a good place to start. We also have a Facebook page where we're constantly posting articles about homeschooling and unschooling, not just about the film, but about things that I find online that are of interest to the subject. And that's facebook.com/classdismissedmovie. So I encourage people to sign up for our page. And resources. I have hundreds of resources that I could send you. So
okay, well, we'll start with the ones you mentioned. There's also a conference that's coming up, right? In an annual conference.
So in California, yes, there's every year they have a big state conference, and it's the HSC conference, the Homeschool Association of California. And this year it's in San Francisco, and it starts on the 28th of July and goes through the 31st.
Mm-hmm. So
I really encourage people who are interested in finding out more to attend that conference if they can. That's actually where we started. We went, when our daughter was 2, just to kind of find out what this homeschooling thing was all about, and we were completely blown away.
Right.
So
we may be out of town, but if we're in town, we're definitely going to be there. I'm looking forward to that.
Well, so the website for that would be hsc.org.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again. This has been wonderful, and we'll let you know when the show's up, and maybe if you have a minute or two and a chance to respond to some of the comments, the folks would appreciate that as well.
Be happy to. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so definitely check out Jeremy's film. We've watched it a couple times now. Watched it once. We had a kind of screening at our house, and everybody was. It's about a 2-hour film, right?
It's 90 minutes.
90 minutes. But it doesn't seem like that. It's really engaging and really illuminating. And I think there was a lot of spirited discussion afterwards. And then, like I said, I showed it to my parents and my wife's parents, and they got a lot out of it as well. So I really recommend checking it out. Okay, that's it for today, and we'll see you next time, everybody. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.